All set. Okay, if this were in person, we'd be able to have our nice and neat little intro, but we're going to make it work. We're going to make it work. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today as we have this discussion about working while Black. There's so much that fits up under that umbrella. Where do we start? How do we unpack this? But today we're going to have our attempt at trying to unpack the systemic racism that operates in the workplace. My name is Danielle Beyer Jackson. I'm the founder of Tell Public Relations, which is headquartered here in sunny Tampa, Florida. And our agency works specifically to help underrepresented groups get more attention for their businesses. And what's funny is, we all have our story of working while Black, which I know many of you are going to share toward the end of our event here today. For me personally, I was a high school English teacher for 6 years and experienced some microaggressions at the hands of my students and their parents, had credentials questioned by administration. And so I thought, well, let me leave and enter corporate. It's probably better there. And then I learned, sure enough, what that was like. And I thought, well, perhaps once I get into entrepreneurship, because I'll be running the show, do my own thing. And working while Black followed me here as well. And so it's just interesting to see, no matter what sector you're in, no matter what level you're on, it is something that many of us unfortunately are facing as Black Americans. So I know that we all have our own personal stories that we want to contribute, and we're going to make sure to reserve time with the last 30 to 40 minutes of our event today to make sure that you all have the space and the time to share some of your experiences as well. We have an all-star panel today, which I'm really excited about, in various industries who are going to lend their insights to the conversation, because there's so much to talk about here when it comes to the mental, emotional, and psychological impacts of being a Black American who works, whether that's corporate or construction. We all have a story to share. So we brought together some people who can help us shed light on this issue, and I'm excited to hear their insights today. Before I introduce the moderator who's going to kind of walk us through here what we've got going on, just a few housekeeping things. The first 35 minutes we're going to dedicate to a really hearty discussion about what it means to work while Black. And then the last 30 minutes will be reserved for you to pose any questions you have to the panel and also to share your personal experiences. We ask that you limit them to 2 minutes just so we can hear as many stories as possible. And then we'll end by providing some resources for everyone so we can know how to empower ourselves, how to advocate for ourselves as we go back to the workplace as soon as, this lunch hour. So hopefully we're equipped to go back and navigate the conflict that many of us are facing. So I want to introduce our moderator, who I'm very excited to have here today. Laura Whitley is a broadcast journalist with more than a decade of full-time newsroom experience. And today, Laura wears 2 hats as both a small business owner and a freelance journalist. She uses her many years of reporting experience and digital storytelling skills when she field produces for marquee network news programs. And with her company, Real Media Solutions, Laura provides a range of communications-related services, including media and public relations, corporate video productions, marketing. She does it all. She's a one-stop shop, and she's perfect to help us lead this conversation. So, Laura, thank you so much for being here and moderating this event for us today.
Danielle, and I appreciate the invitation. It's interesting to hear you reflect on your experience of working while Black. I think we all have an experience, and looking forward to hearing those. And, this is something that, became a reality pretty much as soon as I entered the workplace, as we all did. And I recall that, for most of my career, this was something that you may discuss with other Black colleagues, or you might discuss, with your family, but it certainly wasn't something that was really talked, part of any news headline or out in the forefront. But things have changed. And today, working while Black is a common topic of news stories. Those stories touch on a wide range of issues related with sub-themes that include microaggressions, institutional racism, white supremacy, code switching, all types of discrimination, including hair discrimination. It's really a complex, multi-layered issue. And today our conversation will dive in to that and start to unpack some of that. We will like to introduce our esteemed panelists that will help lead that conversation. And we'll start with the introduction of two of our panelists and they make up the team of 2BS Productions. 2BS is a Black-owned and operated production company dedicated to elevating Black creatives beyond mainstream consumption. We're talking about Ms. Tosca Davis and Mr. Cedrick Smith, who co-founded the company because they believe that storytelling and liberation is intrinsically linked. And they have recently debuted their documentary, To Be Us, To Work, which highlights the physical, mental, and emotional effects of systemic racism in the workplace. Very timely. And this film is really trailblazing across film festivals right now. It recently won Best of Festival in this year's International Black Film Festival. So that's very exciting. And we look forward to talking with them. We next have Ms. Helynn Nelson, who is the human resources professional, a professional committed to optimizing every worker's contributions and development through fair, equitable, transparent, and ethical treatment of all employees. Again, very timely. She has strategically partnered with various nonprofit, governmental, and for-profit organizations to develop and implement performance management and employee development programs, to implement employee relation strategies, address grievances and contract issues, and manage human resource operations. She is currently, of course, I need to mention, she attended Spelman and Tulane University School of Law and is currently a people consultant supporting people operations and the Google Austin site. She's also an adjunct professor at Villanova University. Next, we have Dr. Tani Smithers. She is an interdisciplinary scholar, researcher, professor, writer, thought leader, all of it in the issue of race and gender inequality, diversity, and inclusion. Prior to coming to academia in 2017, Dr. Smithers spent 20 years working in corporate and nonprofit industries, ascending to the partner rank of a Fortune 100 firm. So she knows what she's talking about, y'all. She holds a bachelor's and master's and doctorate degrees from the University of Texas at Austin, Rice University, and the University of St. Thomas. And she's currently a visiting scholar at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers University. So we look forward to speaking from her. And our last panelist for right now, we have Mr. Zachary Nunn, who's based right here in Houston, Texas. He is a Big Four diversity, inclusion, and equity consultant and thought leader as well for over nearly a decade, leading cultural and organizational transformation in a variety of industries. He's the CEO and founder of Living Corporate, LLC, which amplifies and centers marginalized voices at work by interviewing Black and Brown executives, activists, educators, and elected officials, and providing practical insights and that reach over 10,000 listeners a week. So again, so excited to have all of you today to help lead this conversation. And I'd like to go back to our filmmakers of 2BS at Work. You know, the work on this project began long before the flood of headlines and the awareness that we have seen come about in the last, 6 to 8 months. And Tosca, could you please provide some background on the project itself?
Sure, and thank you all for coming. We really appreciate being here. And thank you for listening to us, and we really look forward to hearing your thoughts on the program today. I think the background I take that as, how did we get here? How did we get to the film that we created? We've discovered, that there are three main reasons that we decided to make a film about working while Black. I guess the main reason would be Cedrick would engage in many social justice and activist experiences and events. And there were times when I also would follow him to these events. I wasn't as active as he is, but I would go to some of the meetings with him or some of the conferences with him. And many times during these events, we would discuss, the experiences of Black people. How can we solve some issues surrounding Black folks? Poverty or, inequality, inequity, anything that Black people are experiencing. And I know that Cedrick and I would leave many times, not all the time, but many times we would leave these meetings wondering, why a certain segment of the population or a certain word was not brought up during the meeting, because we believe that white supremacy is the culprit for everything. Basically, anything that creates inequality stems from white supremacy and the colonizing of the entire world. And so we feel as though it's very difficult to heal anything without naming the culprit, without pointing to the culprit, without telling the culprit, this is how you are causing me harm. This is how you're affecting my life. And this is the trauma and this is the violence that happens when you are in power. And so because that wasn't happening, we took it upon ourselves to create a film based around this subject, because we knew, which is the number two reason, we knew that this was a pretty standard universal theme. Most Black people work, and we felt as though we could probably get a good amount of people to participate in filming. Now, again, this happened before the Enlightenment of 2020. So we were asking people to share their employment stories before 2020. We actually filmed this in between March and June of 2019. And so we felt like we can get the most amount of people. We started with the Working While Black theme. The other reason is because we both had, fresh or ongoing Working While Black stories. And mine was particularly harmful and violent, and I never forgot it. And I don't apologize for that. I'm still angry about it. And I am an angry Black woman, and I won't be judged for that. And this was in the nonprofit arena. And the reason why I say it's nonprofit, and specifically Planned Parenthood of Gulf Coast in Houston, is because many times but nonprofits are allowed to get away with their violence and their traumatizing ways. And so I am specifically, I specifically want to make sure we include, government agencies and nonprofits, because they, under the guise of helping people, and typically being run by people who don't look like the people they're helping, they typically traumatize their Black and brown workers who are probably doing most of the work. And so that's why we made this film, is because we want to offer some liberation. And we know that storytelling allows people to feel liberated and feel empowered. And so that's how we came to this film.
Just to kind of piggyback on that, with what Tosca said, Working While Black stories are universal, we felt. And another thing is that when you make a film, it's something that's kind of impetuous. It's something that can be shown. And so instead of having conversations about it, you always have something that is cataloged, which kind of chronicles the experiences of Black people. One of which is how systemic racism affects Black people in the workplace. Now, a lot of the things that I was going to, a lot of the meetings I was going to was around police brutality and the inequities surrounding that. That was kind of like, what the activist work that I was doing. But there's an economic brutality that we don't often talk about. There's so many other types of brutalities that occur, and violence that Tosca talks about which, you know, is not always physical. It's this mental stress. It's this anguish that we have to deal with on a daily basis. So we felt like this movie, as we put it together, the biggest thing was we knew we would have the stories. The issue that we were concerned about was whether or not people would tell it on film. And fortunately for us, they were able to tell it on film. And we feel like we made a great product. And we're looking forward to the rest of the panelists' comments around this issue.
Dr. Smithers, you know, Cedrick is talking about how they compiled all these stories, and then you see the reluctance of people wanting to share their story because, you know, naturally you fear retaliation or backlash and things like that. How have you seen this reflected in your work in terms of that reluctance to share the story for fear of what might happen, or just simply losing one's job and other intangible repercussions?
I think just in general, you know, when you are speaking your truth, there's a fear of retaliation, but there comes a time when you have to own that, right? You know, you can't heal from something if you don't speak about it. And I think, you know, we shoulder a lot. So the individuals that are able to come to terms and share and open up and name it, yeah, they have to risk. There's a big risk there, right? There's a risk of being labeled. There's a risk of being thought of as a troublemaker. But at this point in time, those individuals who are brave enough to step out and speak up, you know, they can move past that. And I think you mentioned this earlier in your own situation, recognizing when it was time to make that exit. You know, you have to make that exit. So is this a place that you want to stay if you are speaking truth and if you are, you know, talking about your situation? If the higher ups are not willing to listen and have, you know, kind of that open door policy around whatever issues that you're facing, then that's not the place for you. So I think it's more about, not to put it on the person, but it's more about, you know, how you take, you know, ownership of what's, not necessarily ownership of what's happening, but the ability to speak out about it. And I think that's so liberating when Tosca talks about, you know, kind of liberating ourselves from this bondage. Because many of us are in corporate America or have been in corporate America, and we did not say anything. And we kind of compounded this trauma from, you know, year after year after year. And once it blows up, it blows up. So those individuals who speak out can be liberated from whatever is sort of keeping them from, you know, moving forward. So it's like paralyzing, right? So that's the important aspect of this.
Thank you. Helynn Nelson, I'd like to bring your perspective, HR, legal, corporate, into this conversation, you know, particularly operating within that, you know, corporate structure environment with the systemic racism and constructs that exist. You know, how do you experience that? And also then how do you work as an advocate to fulfill sort of, you know, what your stated mission and goal is to ensure fair and equitable treatment of employees?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Laura. Absolutely, I have experienced it. I'm, you know, a Black woman in executive spaces, once in legal spaces, and these are institutions that are built on social constructs and, quite frankly, sometimes reinforce them. The way that I simplify a workplace is simply a building full of human beings with shared experiences that may or may not intersect, if not for the fact that they need to report to the same building every single day. So when you think about the nuances and the variables at play in that scenario, you know, it's either the greatest, you know, the greatest environment ever that can produce creativity and, you know, for my job, amazing products for consumers, or you know, it can be a powder keg, and it can be a microcosm of what people experience on the outside of that building. And so both are, you know, the polarity of the situation is that both are true, both and, right? And so the way that I address those is, I did things in a certain order. It all makes sense now. Who knew then? But I was an employment litigator for nearly 10 years in Washington, D.C. And so I often say that, I saw individuals and employers on their worst day having to pay a lot of money and spend a lot of time to explain themselves, right? And so part of me coming in-house was to affect change so that people wouldn't experience that level of impact and trauma in the workplace, right? And so very much so I'm on the front lines. I think the gain of having seen worse days and knowing the law inside and out is that not only can I walk people to the line and go, you see that? Like this is what the causation, and like walk you through that formula. But it also is to influence appropriately and to level set expectations. People are very scared of the law. To the last point, people are very fearful of telling stories because of the retaliatory aspect of it. If you know kind of where it ends and you can reverse engineer and support people where they are and go, don't worry about that, right? I can protect you from that. I can insulate you from that. I know, procedurally how that plays out. I mean, it's a superpower. And I encourage anyone that speaks to me, be it, your entry level, fresh out of college employees that are, ready to take on the world and sometimes clumsily so, to your well-heeled, executives who are very deeply entrenched in how it goes and the way that it goes. And to challenge and disrupt in spaces, and professionally so, right? We're in corporate setting, so professionally so, but to push into that is extremely important, to know what the risks are, to manage those risks and mitigate the risk on behalf of the company, but doing so at the people level. It's all a combination of, right, back to my earlier point, people. So to influence in those spaces, to be confident about what the risk entails, and to implore people to behaviorally change or make a decision to not be a part of the workspace, because there's that too, are ways that I advocate in the role that I'm in.
Thank you. One thing I've been thinking about, and it resonated as you were talking, was it seems as though we're moving not necessarily away from EEOC complaints, but those just being the only way that some of these matters are resolved and solved, to also there being a much more public conversation. And Zachary Nunn, I know that's what a lot of what you do with Living Corporate is, have these open dialogues and conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I want to apologize again, y'all. I'm having some issues with my camera, but I did plug in my mic, so I'm here. So yeah, to your point, I think, storytelling has a lot of different functions. Because we exist in this like really colonialist, white supremacist European context, the idea of qualitative data and storytelling is often poo-pooed as some sort of like lesser point of inform. But the reality is that hearing and understanding folks' lived experience and the journeys that they've had to navigate is overwhelmingly powerful, and will always pull on your heartstrings more than some type of report or data Excel sheet of things. Those things, of course, have their place, but to your point, yes, with Living Corporate, we're focused on centering and amplifying Black and Brown folks at work, and we just have very authentic conversations. We've been blessed to have all types of guests on, and these are leaders within their respective spaces, Fortune 500 companies, elected officials, so on and so forth, just talking about the harms that they've experienced and naming those things. I know people have said that already. There's liberation in that. And so I think what's really interesting, and I think as we continue forward, we talk about, I love to be us, and just what that documentary and all of what that represents, because I do believe the future, when it comes to digital media, when it comes to content creation around Black and brown folks, is going to be telling our stories and our triumphs and our trials.
Thank you. And speaking of the future and telling those stories, Dr. Smithers, if you can share a little bit about what you're, seeing in the world of shaping the minds of those who are in school right now, in University of St. Thomas, and what is the conversation in those academic circles?
Essentially, I teach doctoral level students.
Oh, okay.
So they're all, they're leaders in their organizations, they're educators, principals, just their administrators, right? So we talk about it from a context of, their spaces, very few are in corporate or in higher ed. But ultimately, what I've learned is that in all industries, there's levels of this that's happening, whether it's, my lens, through my lens, originally it was from the corporate lens. But I think that, what opened my eyes in seeing the film were that there were teachers, experiencing this on just a regular basis. And so the conversations are varying. A lot of people have hard times speaking up about that. But I think to Zach's point about the contextual, input, that's important, right? The contextual ideas around, how do I name what's happening to me? Because I think a lot of times we are experiencing things that are quote unquote microaggressions that we don't know that they are that. And so now we have the language to put to this. Unfortunately, the situations that brought us to this place has awakened this like sleeping giant around, all of these issues that are sort of permeating in various points of society. So what I guess encourage people to do, and I have a mixed, audience of people that I teach, is, if you are a white person or a person of a dominant culture, take your feelings out of this, right? Allow that person of color or that Black individual to express him or herself, right? In terms of, what they're feeling. So I think just the dialogue between, both Black individuals, other persons of color, as well as white individuals are very important, because I think that's what was missing. A lot of times we are talking amongst ourselves, but we're not talking to the person that's, sort of the culprit behind maybe what's happening. So I think, the bringing together of the dialogue is the first step. And, asking, what I do is ask people, right? The white fragility, component is having that, not wanting to hurt somebody's feelings or placating to the other group, take that out of that. Because right now we're talking about, how can we as a society sort of come together and work around creating this idea of not just diversity and inclusion, but this equity piece. So that's sort of, what I'm imparting on, I won't say the next generation, but individuals who are already working in our current society.
Thank you. And you bring up, the term microaggressions, and also a realization that so many of us come to in terms of recognizing that you are experiencing that. And I'd like to go back to Cedrick and Tosca, and I was interested to know, you conducted dozens of interviews in the course of developing your film. What were some of the commonalities, I assume there were some commonalities and experiences that you could sort of draw, that many of your subjects shared?
I want to first make sure that we, thank you. I'm going to answer that question. I just want to make sure that we don't fall into the same role as oppressor as as the dominant culture when we exclude persons who are not in corporate America. So I want to make sure that we are including, especially when it comes to Black people, we are mostly not talking about corporate America. We are talking about persons in blue collar who don't have as many opportunities to speak up for themselves as we do. And so I want to make sure that we're including them when we're talking. And I want to make sure that when we have opportunities to help them, to assist them, to speak their truth, that we do that too. So we don't want to be a classist or elitist and have that role and have it, the same thing done to them as has been done to us. So it's some of the commonalities that I noticed, and I'll let Cedrick, come after me. One, I think Tammy brought this up, is the teaching. We had more teachers and more people in education than any other area. And I mean, I have a theory about that, about the many different persons that they encounter during the day. You like Danielle said, you have teachers, other teachers, you have students who absolutely can be, your oppressor. They can absolutely be violent, especially if their parents are like that. And so that's one common thing that we saw, the many people that were in education who had experienced trauma or violence at the hands of white people. I'm trying to, Cedric, you can chime in here. I'm trying to think of any other commonality.
I mean, there's some of the interviews. I was the one kind of tasked early on with this particular project of going out and getting and securing and researching the interviews that we were trying to get. And some of the pre-production phase was literally me going into Black spaces, whether it was, Black businesses or go to a park somewhere. And I had this little Black book, literally, that I was kind of cataloging these stories, and to a person, invariably I would probably start the conversation off by saying, you understand what driving while Black means, right? Because we're more familiar with the police brutality and getting stopped by cops and so forth. And that was an easy one. But then I would invariably say, what does working while Black mean to you? And if I was talking to a group of 3 people, 2 of them would say, I do have a story. And they would start telling their story. And the commonality was some kind of microaggressive thing that happened in the workplace. A lot of the stories hinged on, I'd been working here for 6 years. I even trained like 5 of my superiors or 5 of my bosses, whatever that space was for them. They thought that was really odd because they had all the experience and knowledge and didn't see their careers progressing. Another part of it, as Tosca talked about, was with education and this kind of backhanded approach that people had to whether or not they were, qualified or credentialed in what field they were in, or instead of calling them by their name if they were a doctor in the academic arena, being called Mr. or Mrs., which was kind of like an over-familiar term and less than what they should have been approached in that kind of formal job setting. But across the board, obviously you've had some cases where it was just outright racism, Confederate flags, literally doing things that was going to harm the individual on the work site. To, like I said, these kind of subtle, demeaning things that would be said in all the workspaces, whether it was blue collar or quote white collar jobs. You would see the trauma and the pain and the angst and the internalization of the experiences that they all had, and the quite painful experiences that they were able to express.
And I just want to add that the most common thing is that their issue was not resolved. That's why they were filmed. They were not satisfied with or nothing was done at all. And I suspect that this is not my profession, but I suspect that that's going to be more often than not, especially 2019 and prior. Maybe in 2020, there may be you may be able to resolve these issues now that people, I think, feel more comfortable speaking out. But we shall see. But again, all of these people, none of them got any kind of resolution to the issue.
And another thing that was very common was that many had they had multiple stories. It's not like a one-off. So, I mean, literally, of the stories that they may have told on film, there were 5 or 6 other stories that they could have told, but this is the one they chose to tell in particular. So yeah, the overriding commonality, in my opinion, was that it wasn't just one story, but multiple stories that they had.
And you bring up a great point in terms of the lack of resolution, and I'm curious to know, you know, maybe Helynn, you would be good to address this, or Dr. Smithers. How, you know, what is the most effective? What are some of the most effective channels to have these issues resolved? To you know, it's one thing to say, oh, you should speak up, and what do you do? What's the 101? What's the roadmap?
Laura, I'm sorry. Can you repeat the question? I had it was coming across kind of garbled.
Sure. I was just saying, in terms of seeking resolution, trying to address these experiences of discrimination that, you know, one may experience in the workplace, you know, what do you think are some of the most effective ways to address them?
And
oh, go ahead, Dr. Smithers.
No, you go ahead. She's talking to either one of us, but go ahead, because
yes.
I think, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think, you know, the first step is to have some awareness around it. You know, I think we've said this best on this panel, but, you know, a lot of these feelings, you know, associated with actions or things that are done to Black folks in the workplace don't require a second guess or a benefit of the doubt. It is what it is. So call it what it is, and document that, right? To the other panelists' point, qualitative data gets to be very tricky, but it becomes sound when you mark it by time, when you document it. Here goes my legal brain, right? Like, so when you document it and you provide either, and it can be a one-off, it doesn't have to be a series of stories, but inevitably we can kind of connect the dots and figure out from a trend extrapolation or data perspective how pervasive the issue or concern is, or the actions of a certain person. It's usually not in isolation. I mean, this is who these folks are, right? So more than likely, if it's being exacted on one person, it's being exacted on many. And again, it doesn't need to be like a line full of people wrapped around the block to prove the point. However, having the courage of your convictions, listening to your gut, and flagging it to a trusted advisor. And I know that's carefully held for us because that doesn't normally present itself in safe psychological spaces in the workplace. That's okay. It can be someone outside of the workplace that you can then reference when it comes in. Hopefully, and I know this is like a long shot, there's someone in HR that you can reach out to discuss this, right? And to action this and advocate on your behalf. But that's the first thing. Like these concerns often have to escalate in order for any actionable resolution or progressive disciplinary action to take place. And so we need to know about it first in order to do something and put a plan in place. I'll toss it to you, Dr. Smithers.
And you covered it, but I'm going to give you a question after I make the comment. So you covered much of it. You know, when you look at this for Black individuals in the workplace in general, you know, all of this is like what they call death by 1,000 cuts. There's always going to be one thing after another that's being done to us. And to Helynn's point, documentation is really important. The documentation is important, but also the advice I would give would be to create that documentation or that write-up when you're ready to make that complaint from a place of, you can't have that emotion. It has to be very objective. But my concern or question to you, Helynn, is that when you're making that complaint, right, and you are quote unquote representing HR, you mentioned this earlier, you're representing the company. And so having a quote unquote trusted advisor within the company or outside of the company, like for me, that trust is not there. Like I didn't trust anybody, you know? And so, you know, having, I guess, I don't know if it's legal counsel or someone outside to really have your back, because at the end of the day, as you mentioned, the HR person's job is to protect the brand of that company, right? So how would you, I guess, advise someone around that?
Yeah, to your point, you know, if a trusted advisor is not HR and any representation or person who holds agency for the company or organization, if those two folks aren't embodied in one, and that's usually the case, you can, so there are escalation points, you know, personally that you can take. You don't have to be hamstrung by what's available or who's listening to you in the company. There's several ways to get the company's attention. An escalation pathway within a corporate setting certainly does. But if you bring in individuals, an attorney, that certainly gets our attention. And let me say something else too, because I know that costs money, and we can talk about, you know, the barriers or constraints to present in a certain way to advocate for yourself. So here's a shortcut. You say, I'm being discriminated. This is how to personally escalate in writing to anyone, right? And use your platform or company, you know, a la company email to do this. I feel like I'm being discriminated against. I have suffered, you know, microaggressions that are taking a psychological, you know, that I'm taking a psychological hit from. I feel like I'm being retaliated against. Anytime these words, and there's several more, come across to anyone who is an agent of the company, your manager, it doesn't have to be someone in HR, traffic stops. And that person then becomes on notice as an agent of the company that there is an aggrieved party, and they're aggrieved based on something perceived, actionable or otherwise in this company, and we need to do something about it. Because inevitably, about documentation and marking time, if that finds its way into lawsuit territory or, you know, whatever kind of legal action, someone's able to go back to that and say, hey, I told y'all, and you didn't do anything about it. So now even the way in which you address my grievances is traumatic for me. So it all compounds, and it honestly puts the company in a defensive posture that will certainly get their attention, and they'll be all ears. So
can we just put a pin right there? Like, I feel like we all need a manual that needs to go out to every, you know, 15-year-old or 16-year-old with this roadmap, you know, like this is what you do if you're experiencing this in the workplace. It's just, you know, that is really powerful in terms of understanding some really basic steps of how to address. And the other thing that you mentioned, and Tosca, you talked about this right from the beginning, is the trauma. There is a trauma that you know, occurs for many people when they're experiencing this discrimination, it's I'm just curious in terms of, you know, as we think about having a conversation about that, how much that, you know, is a common experience as well. You know, this kind of trauma that's just to understand where that trauma is coming from. Like, I guess what I'm saying is, looking at first, it's a confusing situation when you're the victim of discrimination. You're not sure if it's you, is it your work product, is it them? So there's like this whole inner dialogue. I know personally I've experienced, and I don't think I'm alone.
Tosca, if you don't mind, can I take this, Tosca?
Yes, and I would definitely respond after you.
Yeah, I was going to say that, you know, in the film, what we saw was that a lot of people didn't have resolution. And what you saw, that actually the people were kind of gaslighted. You know, you have instances where people did bring up their grievances, did tell somebody about what was going on, and did not get any empathy, did not receive any guidance on a resolution that was going to occur. I think that's a reality that occurs. Yes, does it happen that there is a resolution that occurs that was a positive outcome for the individual? Yes. In our film, we didn't find that so much. And even in the stories of people that I cataloged that were not in the film, doing my research, I had one case in particular where, I just found it to be so egregious on a number of levels, in that this person was an Ivy League like school educated. This person had an advanced degree. This person was in the same position as a fellow white man, and this person was a Black woman, and they were making the same money in the same position. And what was interesting about this story was that they ended up sending out, because this was a public institution, the salaries that everyone was making. And so you can see what everyone was making. And the Black woman was literally making $30,000 less than the white man in the same position, and he did not have a college degree. So here's someone that has an MBA and an undergraduate degree from I want to say like an Ivy League type school. I don't want to make it so where it's identifiable. And not only did she take it to the boss thinking that it was going to be handled easily, the boss looked at her and said, no, it's not going to happen. And it was a woman that was the boss. She said, okay, well, I'll take it to the higher person. Didn't happen. Took it to EEOC. Got to EEOC. It was a man that took her case. And even he was like, well, and as soon as he said, well, that's when she had to say and threaten to go get a lawyer just to get equal pay when she has all the credentials in the world for this position. Not only after that, after they apparently rectified the situation, another email comes out with all the data for the salaries, and she's now making $4,000 less than the white man that she first went for the complaint for and had to start the whole process over again. This is traumatic. This is exhausting. And I don't think people realize how exhausting the process is for people to go through, and how we have a different experience before we come to work that is different than a lot of people because of the history of this country. We're not just dealing with the workplace racism that goes on. We're dealing with systemic racism from the time you wake up and comb your hair. And so I think that type of inequity is hard to make right in the work setting, and just kind of have this kind of linear or binary way of correcting it, if you will. And I mean, I could go on and on stories, and Tosca, I'll turn to you, because that was one story I wanted to get out, because it kind of showed the anatomy that I know so many people are going through, from blue collar to white collar jobs.
And you touched on what I was going to say, Cedrick, is that, Laura, you talked about the trauma and the violence, and part of that is exhaustion, is that you mentioned that people may ask themselves, well, is it me? Is it because of my race? Is it because, well, white men don't ask that question. They don't have to go through all of those questions. They will never think that it's because they're white. Okay. Most white women are not going to think that either. They're not going to never, oh, is it because I'm white? Is it because of my hair? Is it because they don't have to do any of that. That's why it is, as a Black person, it's exhausting living in a world with structural and systemic racism. And so, again, Cedrick was going to touch on this too. It is I think we sent out a link of one of our storytellers talking about diversity and inclusion, and how he didn't really believe in it. That would be true for 2BS Productions. That makes us sound very simplistic that we don't believe in it. But here's where we are as 2BS Productions. You can have a diversity and inclusion department and still be committing environmental racism. You can be promoting Black people to VP, but you have chemicals, next to a river, next to Black people. So how is that inclusive? How is that equitable when you're poisoning Black people? So in these big Fortune 500 companies, the salaries are so much larger than the Black people or the brown people. They probably are spilling chemicals. They're probably doing all kinds of systemic and structural racist things that no one is talking about. But guess what? They promoted, Tyrone. And we're gonna put that all over the newspaper, and Tyrone is probably gonna be the VP of diversity and inclusion, because that's where they stick Black people, and they also stick Black people in human resources. So, and when I say stick, I don't mean that they're confined to jail. I mean that's where we end up, because once we become vice president or president or C-suite, you're gonna, if they're the only Black people in the company, they're probably gonna be in human resources. So diversity, equity, inclusion, that sounds awesome. But when you take a big look at the picture of the company, what they're producing, if they're exploiting Black and brown people, what is diversity and inclusion? If you're poisoning me, or if you're poisoning my grandma, or if you're charging $300 for insulin, who cares if Tyrone is the president of, product marketing, if I'm charging $300 for insulin when it only costs $6. So that's where we are as 2BS Productions. Like, okay, right. Diversity and inclusion, cool. What is your company? How is your company exploiting my people?
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted. That, just so thought-provoking in all of what you're saying. Dr. Smithers, did you have something else you wanted to add?
I was just agreeing with everything she said. I totally get it. I think what and I'm going to interpret it in this way. So having worked in areas in corporate America where, you're in the money-making business, right? So to her point, there are positions that we tend to, sit in. We need those positions. But, in my career, a part of it was, you want to make sure that you're in the revenue generation side of the business. So I used to be a fundraiser. I used to be a salesperson. And so those are the roles that I went for in nonprofit and in corporate America, because that's what, the powers that be told me, that I should be doing. And, but the other positions is valuable, but they also, stick us in areas like, so let's say they are promoting, people in corporate America. You could be set up to fail in instances. And so a lot of times, for women, we hear this thing called the glass ceiling. For Black women or Black individuals, we hear this thing called the concrete ceiling, because there's only so high up that we can go. But I've also seen in those instances where, let's say, okay, we'll give this person a promotion. We talk about promotion parity or pay parity. We give this person a promotion, but the company or that division may already be on its last leg. So they give you the promotion. It's like they're setting you up to fail. So essentially, and I talk with my hands, so excuse me, but essentially, that's also a level of, I would say, discrimination or, some type of unconscious bias in itself. So I just want to kind of add that piece.
And I saw a comment, and I was thinking about it too, in terms of the idea of, are you part of the solution or part of the being the role of the oppressor? Even as Black people, I think, we can certainly, I think we were warned of that with one of our panelists earlier, play into the role of an oppressor as well, in terms of oppressing other Blacks and minorities in these spaces.
Yeah, I mean, listen, when you talk about gatekeeping and internalized racism, again, it's still a part of a system, and a part of that system of white supremacy. So to think that there are Black people who don't take on the characteristics of that system is naive. Yes, there are some that do. I mean, some of our stories, even in the movie, and some of the stories of the research I did in pre-production, many of the interactions that Black people had where they were had a lack of empathy when they were trying to find somebody to talk to about their issue, or were stymied in their progress, was at the hands of somebody in a position of power who happened to be Black. But again, we have to peel the layers back and get to the core and the scab of the situation and understand that even that is a function of racism. It is a function of white supremacy. I've had instances where, one case in particular that I can think of, I have like this Rolodex of stories because of all the pre-production that I did and going out and doing the research. A gentleman who worked in IT, and he would talk about that he would go to these meetings where they had to come up with the solutions to the technical problems that they were facing from an IT standpoint. And invariably there's 20 people in the room. He's one of the Black people in the room, and they would go around trying to find the solution to the problem. And he tells of instances, not an instance, and he tells of instances where if the white people that were asked, what's the solution to this, didn't know the answer to it, all of a sudden the meeting was ended. Okay, guys, we don't know the answer to it. And he literally, as a Black man, is sitting in the room with the solution to the problem and was never asked. And he says to himself, why should I raise my hand and go, hey guys, when they don't even count me in the equation in the room? He's seen as a tasker. And so this happens so often that it's so inefficient in a way, it's systemic racism, but it's also efficient in a way in that it stymies efficiently. One of the questions that I was looking at on the in the chat room was talking about, can we talk about unconscious bias? Let's talk about this unconscious bias, and it does exist. If I say CEO to most people in this forum, they think men first because of the system of patriarchy that we think that's a man thing. If I say laundry or cooking, typically people think unconscious bias wise, we think of women, that's a woman's role. They have these gender specific roles that they go to because we've been taught to think that way. But what we want to address as 2BS Productions is the conscious bias. Because when we start talking about the unconscious bias, it's almost like we come into a classroom thinking that the classroom with this EEOC class going to go over is that we're all equitable. And we're saying we're not equitable because Black folks were brought here as slaves. Chattel slavery was a trauma that Black folks experienced, and to this day still has an impact on our lives as we navigate the system to this day in 2020. So I just kind of wanted to address, not to say that unconscious bias doesn't exist, but again, in looking at the diversity and inclusion and EEOC curriculum, to us, it doesn't get to the scab. And if you do not get to the scab, we believe that is where healing begins, and that is where true change can be derived from. I don't know if Zach is still on here, but Zach has done a ton of interviews, and I'm just curious as to what he thinks.
Yeah, to your question, to your point, I think that I think what makes Living Corporate unique and what makes these conversations unique collectively is that we are attacking the white-centric and white supremacist nature of diversity and inclusion in the language that's often employed within the subject matter space. So like unconscious bias, assuming positive intent, and other terms are really meant to support and reinforce the patriarchy and reinforce white supremacy by not really holding institutions accountable and naming the harm that those in the collective majority create and commit against marginalized people. And so we can talk about unconscious bias. I'm just much more, like, I think to your point, Cedrick, I'm just more like curious and excited to talk about dismantling systems, bureaucratic systems that were built with a certain power structure in mind, that were built to maintain order and control first and profit first, that were not built with any type of space or consideration towards Black liberation or brown liberation or certainly not the liberation of Black women It's built literally to keep folks under their thumb. Like that's, and I know I'm coming here as the owner of like a digital media network, but again, like my background is in consulting, and before that I was human resources. So I've seen, like I'm actively in the corporate space. I talk to all types of professionals, and I see how these structures are set up, and frankly, how they always push back. You think about the murder of George Floyd and the continuous brutalization of Black people by the hands of the state. And there's a pattern of corporate statements, some type of initiative where they ask a bunch of Black folks to do things for free. And then it kind of just fizzles away until the next Black person is murdered on camera. And so there needs to be a fundamental shift and change in how we discuss these things. And then from there, action to be taken on how we then dismantle these institutions that don't serve us.
Thank you, Zach. And speaking to the root, really getting to that scab, I'd like to introduce another voice to this conversation, and that's of Dr. Cathy Royal. She's a human and organization development professional, and she specializes in social justice leadership in organization transformation. She is currently an adjunct with Colorado Technical University. She has been fighting this battle for over 50 years, and she actually developed the Quadrant behavior theory, and I'll let her explain that. She'll do a much better job than I will, but it is a dynamic theory that supports change agents in expanding their understanding of the behaviors that create and sustain societies and systems. Dr. Royal, thank you for joining us.
Oh my goodness, thank you. And I apologize for being a little bit late. I got locked out. It said, all sales are closed. And then I said, okay, I know Danielle gave me a workaround, so I have to find the workaround. And that kind of probably speaks to the lives of women and men of color, BIPOC communities in corporations. We are always looking and trying to find the workaround. So the metaphor worked today. I want to say a little bit as you close out this conversation. It's really been an honor to just kind of listen in to Cedrick and Zach and others and read what's in the chat box. So I'm going to ask you to just kind of think with me in terms of as you go into the question and answer period. We talk about a white supremacist culture and white supremacy. And I'd like for you to take supremacy out of that and think about white culture. Because white culture, we don't necessarily have the hoods and the robes and the Boogaloo boys and the Proud Boys sitting at the CEO level. But I'm looking in the chat room and there are people talking about even when you have power in a system or you have authority. Because I don't think right now in the culture that we have, given that it is an organization designed on skin color privilege, so we don't necessarily have all of the power that we would like to have, that we deserve to have. So when we think about white culture, that goes into the idea of unconscious bias or conscious bias or discrimination against each other. Because the culture is the platform that we all live on. So when I talk to my clients and things like that, I say none of us came to this culture multicultural by birth. We all learned racism. We all learned sexism, as Cedrick was saying. So if we're talking about what comes next, in my work, I'm not interested in a new normal or a next normal. I'm interested in a new culture. And that is going to require us to really look at what does it mean to have 600 years of internalized oppression, because the BIPOC community or the Native American, the indigenous communities, and all of us may have an indigenous ancestor in us, the land remembers. So if the land remembers and all of us go back to our ancestors through the land, we remember as well. The soul remembers the internalized and the brutality. So we need new seeds. We need an entirely different platform, because you now are living on a tectonic shift. Whatever's going to happen in the next 2 weeks, on the 4th of November or the 21st of January, within that time, it is going to almost be epic in terms of the resistance around not white supremacist culture, but white culture. Because the notion of a white supremacist culture often, how do I want to say this, often excuses the good person who puts the Black Lives Matter sign in her window and does nothing else. Because the next thing is I go right back into my corporate office, my corner office, even climbing the corporate ladder, and I've done my part. And that's white culture. We make a sign, we talk to each other, and I'm going to ask you, as you do your Q&A, to please define microaggression. Because how many times can you put your foot on my neck and it still be micro? And you excuse me. Oh, I didn't know. If you are over the age of 10 in the United States of America, sometimes spelled with a K, you know what you are doing. And so that's white culture. You know that you can get away with it by giving an excuse. You know that you can get away with it by, I apologize, I didn't know. So if we just think about I love to call him the geek of all geeks, the Black man who was bird watching in New York City in the park, and the white woman comes up with her camera, tells him is filming him, and says, I'm going to take a picture, I'm going to call the police. And then when it was all over, said, I didn't know. Well, Karen, if you had the camera up and calling the police, you knew. So this conversation around microaggressions and white supremacist culture, I'm joining that. And as they say at the poker table, I'll see you that and raise you one. Because if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to take the language and give it back to them in a different way. And I just love the picture. I'm going to take a screenshot because I'm looking at all these wonderfully beautiful young people. And I'm thinking, we did something right. We did something right, because oftentimes my generation, because clearly I'm on the other side of 60, my generation is often accused of not having done anything. We had the civil rights movement and then we let it go. And the children of the civil rights movement lived in their privilege and they moved to the suburbs and they did this and they did that. But if I'm looking at you, we did something right. So my life is in your hands. My life is in your hands. So if I've been in this struggle for 50 years and managed to create an act of resistance by staying alive and an act of courage by thriving, my life is in your hands. We need new seeds, we need new words, we need new culture. Because to build on the same platform, you can't get it out because the land remembers and the soul remembers. So let's give the soul some new memories.